Welcome to Access Europe for July 2025. Today we are pleased to welcome back Pete Poppe, known as Maj P or Major P at various forums, particularly Access World forums. And Pete last year did an excellent presentation on treeviews, which has been one of the most popular videos we've had on YouTube in the last year. And so I'm pleased to welcome him back to do what's going to be, I believe, a very interesting presentation, faking non-normal user interfaces with normal data. Now, he'll explain what that all means properly. The presentation slides are available now, and the databases will be also available. Pete, are you ready? I will pass over to you.
First of all, thank you for having me. Thank Colin for putting this on. And as mentioned, I was back here, I think last August. I did a presentation on treeviews, and it'll be a little relevant for today, but the link is right there. So there's a little bit more background on myself. My background and how I got into Access, I was actually a career Marine officer, but I ended up getting into what they call the supporting force. I was doing a lot of acquisition work, bringing on new systems, the requirement generation, the engineering, the test and evaluation. So I supported that. And then even after I retired, I was a defense contractor from 2008 to 2022, doing a very similar thing. And then how I got into Access was early 2000. I was doing operational testing. And operational testing is if we're going to purchase this multi-billion-dollar weapon system, before the government goes out and does it, they have to prove in a real-world operational environment that this is effective and suitable. And so I was doing that. I was a lead tester, a data analyst. And this is early 2000s. We're doing this testing on remote ranges or on remote bases. Even if there was internet connection, we wouldn't have had it anyway. And we were kind of doing a lot of repeating these processes, multiple tests. So we would go out and we would hire third parties to develop these Access databases. And after a while, I just took a stab at it and said, we can start doing this ourselves. And we were using them for different things. So imagine you're on the test. We're collecting test results, pass, fails. We would do user surveys. We were tracking engineering requirements and putting those against results. So it was early 2000. If you had a problem and you wanted to learn, you didn't have a lot of YouTube videos. You didn't have AI. So I was going out onto the forums, asking questions. And eventually it was like, hey, I think I can answer that one. Oh, cool. That was fun. I answered another one. And that's actually how I really learned how to do Access, was answering questions on these forums. So I was a real power user. I was developing these just for myself so we could do our work in the Marine Corps. And then when I retired and I was supporting the government, I was building these applications. So I never really sold them. These were things for our personal use or my organizational use, or I'm providing it to the government. So I would say I'm a hobbyist. I'm not a professional. I don't sell applications. I don't build them for a living, but I make them so I can use them. All right. So the problem statement, there are certain Access data structures or requirements you have that sometimes make it very difficult to build a user interface using the native controls, the native forms and subforms. And for many users, maybe it can be done, but it's hard to visualize how you would do that and how you would build that interface. So then what happens often are users, and I'm sure you've seen this, they will start making non-normalized data structures just so they can support a perceived user interface. And you've seen this. This is often referred to as building Excel in Access. And although we see novices do this a lot, once you start getting into more advanced data structures, and I'll talk about like hierarchical data, it gets hard to visualize how you're going to build an interface. So people, even more seasoned developers, will build this non-normalized structure just so they can come up with some kind of user interface to support it. And I would say often the solution is just kind of maybe think out of the box a little different. What I've seen is there's often some common problem areas that kind of pop up. Obviously, the first thing is anytime a user wants something that looks and acts like a spreadsheet. We've been doing summing this way for a long time. The data is naturally rows and columns. We want to build something like that. When I go put it in a table, it becomes a bunch of long records instead of a bunch of columns. So yeah, any problem that's intuitively a grid. And for those of you who may have developed in Visual Studio, I've done a little bit. This is my public service announcement for anyone with ties to Access is, if we could get some kind of grid control, like a data grid view, where you can on the fly define rows and columns, and in those columns define what type of controls. That's what I've seen in Visual Studio. That would probably solve most of this conversation we're having today. That and along with a native tree view would also be nice. Another big problem I see is the scheduling, the Outlook. I want to do something like that where I want to have appointments and time slots. And although I'm not going to talk about this one, and maybe someone will do a future Access Your presentation, is surveys. Just because I know building surveys, it is an art form of proper normalization because it is many to many to many to many, with many users taking many surveys with many questions and many possible responses and many possible response groups. So it gets really hard to build that and then present that information in a way that's not thousands of columns. Checklists, another problem where the user wants to pick from a list of things, wants to see all the possible choices and be able to click quickly. Calendar displays, that's a very common one. And then hierarchical or self-referencing data. So today's objective is really to show some tips, tricks, workarounds, and a lot of stuff that I've gathered over time. I haven't come up with all these. I've seen other people do these. So if you're looking for earth-shattering code, probably not going to do a lot of that today. It's really kind of more ways to think out of the box and think about the interface. And like I said, I've seen a lot of these that other people have done, and you've probably done a lot of these. Like it's not earth-shattering stuff, but I will not do a deep dive into any of the solutions. I will provide some links to where you can see people have done real good deep dives. And then I just throw this caveat out because, once you start building your own kind of like interfaces and you go away and enhance that traditional form, subform, you got to really weigh the pros and cons. The native forms and the native controls, they're all well proven, all the events that go with them. So it's just something to think about. And then just my call out, hopefully the real main objective is to convince users that, hey, you don't have to come up with this wacky, non-normalized data structure just to support what you think you need. There are ways we can get around that. So to do that, these are kind of a list of the common techniques I use. Probably most of you have used this one where you will take a crosstab query, and then now you've taken that very linear and turned it into columns, and then you can click on the columns and get a pop-up and edit that. One that's kind of real simple is what I say, preloading the records using like an insert query. This may be something like a workflow where the user doesn't want to have to select all the tasks or items using a subform. Well, you can just preload those records to start with. I'll talk something called my pseudo grid control. That's just a made up name. Obviously, temp tables, pure unbound forms that aren't tied to any kind of table. I'll show one that, of anything that may be unique in this presentation, is this graphical display, my pseudo georeference form, and then a light conversation about tree views and fake tree views. And again, you can reference my longer presentation on that. I think one theme on most of these techniques is you build this interface that allows for display and navigation, and then most of them you simply click on it or have something where you get a pop-up to a bound normal form to do your editing. The agenda, I'm not going to include all the techniques, but these are the ones I am going to hit. I'll hit a scheduling problem, unbound forms, a checklist with multiple ways to do it, using a crosstab, something I call the cascading combo dilemma, the tree views, and the georeference. And I think the presentation is a little long. I'm going to try to go fast. But if time permits, maybe some open discussion end of what you've seen and some of the ideas to get around it. Okay, the first problem is that I want to show is the scheduling problem. And you're probably familiar with this. They want to do something like Outlook. So in the problem I had, they had multiple buildings and every building had several conference rooms. And then they wanted to be able to reserve it in half-hour time slots starting at 10 in the morning to 7 p.m. And so what was the user trying to do? Well, they couldn't envision this. So they had a table for each room. There's 26 rooms, 26 tables, a field then for each of those time slots, 18 time slots, and then they would add a record for a day. So you can see that's pretty unmanageable. So I looked at it, and this is the thing I call a pseudo grid control. And it's really just a matter of storing the data in normalized fashion, a simple appointment. We would all have a start and stop period. And in this case, we have the person who made the reservation, what room they're reserving, what type of appointment, and then some additional notes. So that's how we would store the information. And this is how we would then, for display purposes, push the information when we pick that data display and that room. We push that information for that day into this gridded out table. So on this table, there'd be a column for every room. You can see there's a column for what the time period is and then the actual start and stop time. So you pick the day and basically you're going to clear out the display from the existing values and then repopulate the cell with the correct values for that correct day in that correct room. So I call this a pseudo grid, call it a temp table, but in this case, that table is going to be bound to the form as a continuous form. And I'm not in like a temp table, I kind of think of something where you write records, you might delete the table, but here it's all gridded out ahead of time. All you're doing is filling the cells in and then clearing the values out of those cells for the room. So what is the actual data? Like as you expect, very simple, which your foreign keys to the room, who reserved it, your start and stop period. Then take that at put a query to bring the details together so that you have something to display. And then when you go select on the form, when you go to select that room, you would move the information into the correct place in the grid for display purposes. So Sandy Holder reserved room 1 at 10 to 10:29 or that first time slot. And then we just move it. We write to the grid table and then we can display. So this is what the form would look like. So one thing you can see, this across the top here, I got tabs for every one of the buildings, and then every building has rooms below it. You can see which rooms are. So you may think, well, this is a bunch of subforms. It's just one subform. And that one subform is down below in design view. And then what you do is when you pick the day, it's going to fill that grid table up with the correct information into the correct slots. And then the only difference is when I pick the tabs from the top, it just decides which one of these rooms to bind in the control source and then fills the labels. So if I pick, like right now, I'm on DR ground room floor, which has rooms 1 to 5. I fill labels 1 to 5. As you can see in the black arrow, I set the correct room captions, and then I bind columns 1 to 5. And then when I want to go edit these values, I just click a cell. So as you expect, I can navigate to a different day. I only have stuff in for here. When I move to this day, it populates those values into the correct cell of the table. And then I can just, I do a pop-up. I pick a person. I give it title, whatever the appointment is. And then I say booking and it's closed. Okay. I think that's it for that. So a very similar idea, the user, they wanted to filter these items. They have a bunch of categories for different types of sales. I'm not sure if it's all sports equipment, but different types of sales. So you would do the filter. The requirement was they wanted to make this compact and have their information displayed in 3 columns. Now, I went back to him and said, well, you probably could go 5 because you got plenty of room. But you can see that in the upper right, that's the gridded table. Is I just save for the 3 different images I want to display. I save their path and their name. Now, this one's a little different. And I went back when the first one, I said I never have to delete or add records to that table. In this one, I am going to, every time I do my filter for the items I want to display, I'm going to delete all the existing records out, and then I'm going to read my normalized data table and repopulate this for display. Now, the difference here, once you start adding and deleting, you need to start worrying about bloat. So it's either you've got to put a strategy to do compact or repair, or you could do something like a side database where you blow that away at the end, or we'll talk about you could do this with an in-memory record set. So you just build it dynamically and then it goes away. If you can think about this, there's basically a column. If I do my filter and I get 9 items, well, then I start reading my record set of the 9 items. The first one I put in image path 1, second one in 2, third and 3, add a new record, fourth goes in 1 again, fifth goes in 2 again, sixth goes in 3, add a new record. And then as we talked about, the next one is kind of the spreadsheet interface. So I don't really have a good example for this, but you can see lots of them, and I have some links at the bottom. But that's often what the user wants to see. I want to see my stuff in this column or display. Using some creativity, you could do something like this, and you can even add the traditional features you have in Excel. You can have up and down arrow keys. And none of my examples today do I do the edits directly in the cells, but you can add that too, where you can, in your temp table, you could do your edits or clear them out and then write back to your table. All my examples use that kind of pop-up idea where you pop up to just a standard form and you make your edits there. There's some benefits of doing that with the data, and you can apply a lot more data rules. So you may ask, why go through this grid idea? Couldn't you do the same thing with Unbound Form? Just make all the controls that you need. And I'd say yes and no. You have to think about it. So when the number of rows and columns is few, then maybe it's fine to make a pure Unbound Form, and it may save you time. But when you start having a lot, it's probably easier to design, build, and maintain using this kind of pseudo grid concept. So just remember this problem, there was 18 rows time slots. You could have up to 6 max rows. So that's 108 controls that you have to size, move, rename. If you remember, my solution had 6 controls or 6 text boxes, 6 labels across the top. That's all I had to worry about. And then, of course, if that number of rows and columns could change, that pseudo grid idea, or especially the rows, the pseudo idea makes sense. If you think about it a little bit, I had my time slots, I think every half hour. I could move them to 15 minutes by just adding rows to my table, just gridding it out a little bit more. If I did that with a pure Unbound Form, I'd have to add all those additional controls. I know there's some people who are really into building kind of dynamic Unbound Forms, and what they would say, well, I can do that. I'll just add 200 controls and then at runtime move all those controls, position them into the right places, bind them, add the control sources or whatever. Oh, actually, I guess in that case, it wouldn't have any control sources. But yes, you can do that, but you just have to weigh the work. So I'm not saying it's one or the other. I think you just have to weigh it to how much effort and how much flexibility you need. But then the most common Unbound Form to do this idea is probably the calendar. You just have your cells for all your days. You're going to read your normalized information, and you're going to put it in there for display. I've seen many examples. In fact, this one's not mine. But then you click on one of the days, you can add your information. It would go back into the standard format of start date, stop, what the note is. This one is relatively easy to do, and there's lots of examples. I will say I've seen so many examples of users trying to build this with some really crazy table structures. So again, it's really today is about showing some ways to do this to get the end results you want. And I'll caveat for unbound forms, I'm big of doing stuff like this is extending what I can do with the Access native forms. I personally am I'm not a fan of building unbound data entry forms for just the sake of building unbound forms. I think at that point, if you're trying to outsmart Access to do that, there's really better environments you can be designing in. But you can take that same idea now a little more extreme. This is one I had built. The user wanted to come up with an idea to do an entire year view and then make the entries for that date. These are absences, and each absence has a code color, and has a time amount of time that you can do. So, keep the data normal like any appointment thing. This looks like a bunch of controls, but it's really 12 subforms. And so each subform, you just dynamically show and hide the right labels to make it look like a calendar. And then the one trick I came up with, I'm doing some rich text formatting. So you could see in the month of March, for example, I have 2 colored cells in here. That's just a text box using rich text formatting around the 2 different concatenated entries. So I concatenate data for display and then put it in the right place. And then the same idea, this is instead of making your entries right on the calendar form, you click on it, you get your pop-up, and then you make your changes. So the crosstab as a grid, I think maybe this is the most common that you see people do, or one at least people are probably most familiar with. I think they call it the frequency illusion. Once I started building this presentation, I started seeing so many examples of people saying, yeah, I hear you, but I need to do my interface like this. So I'm going to build this wacky table. You can read the quote at the bottom where the user just said, yeah, I hear you guys, but I'm going to go do it wrong anyway, basically. But in this timely one, I think I saw it on Access World Forms, and there's a link to it. The user has insurance quotes by company, and each needed to have 5 quotes per customer. And so, of course, he made each column. One column was Geico, State Farm, et cetera, et cetera. And all the experts on the site, they all chimed in. No, no, no. You need a customer table, like something like a company table, and then you need a junction table. So you can put these quotes in there. And they showed examples of, a traditional form for the customer and then a subform for each of the quotes. And I understood exactly what they were saying is they had to do those 5. Geico, State Farm, blah, 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 whatever those were. They didn't want to have to come to a pull down choice and add each of the records separately. They wanted to have them already appear. So the first one, I thought this is what they want. And I said, well, we can do that just with a crosstab query. I do a Cartesian join of all the customers with the 5 required companies, and that will build my query. I bind it to the form, and the same idea. I keep my data in the way we would normally do it in a customer table, a company table, and then my junction table for the quotes. But the idea was that it's use the crosstab, display the information, click on a cell, get your pop-up. Pop-up would put it into your junction table in a normalized form. But then I really thought about this. There's an alternate solution. Really, what the user was asking, and they would be fine if those 5 companies were preloaded. So when you added a new customer, you would get the 5 records. Now all you have to do is put in values. So that was, I thought about it is this is really what they would want. They could define which companies they wanted to go get quotes from. They could modify that. But as soon as they created a record for John Smith, it would create the child records already, and then simply do that. And they're like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. So just a little simple thinking out of the box, and that avoided them from having to do a non-normalized with a bunch of columns for each of the different quotes. All right, the checklist, another common problem. So the user wants to select from a list of things for a given record. So that's usually maybe it's a person and they have to do certain activities. The big one you see a lot are yes, no accomplishments, where there's a column for every accomplishment, things that got completed, and you have to check them as being complete. Inspections, and then maybe things like you're selecting ingredients or components for something. Now, you could always do this with a form, master form, and a subform, but users don't want to do that because one, they want to see all the possible choices. They want to see clearly what they've selected and yet what has not yet been selected. And they don't want to go through that, more time consuming of picking the drop down and add in a record. And as I said, I mean, this is the most common one where you just see a very non-normalized structure of a bunch of many, many, many columns. And even though that's not normalized and it has all those downstream effects, if you can show the user that doing it that way is also much more time consuming, creating all these extra fields just so you can have extra columns, and then God forbid they want to change something or add something or change the form, it's really convincing them doing it right is actually going to save you a ton of work. And so all the checklists to me are all the same. It's always a many to many where you have a selections table and then you have that items table that's going to associate it to the selection. So maybe that's a person or some kind of task or something that's going to then in the junction table be related to all those selections. So in this case, I got a users table, and then my selection tables are activities that need to get performed. And they're kind of grouped up pre-engagement, mid-engagement, post-engagement activities. Now you'll see there is a field called selected, and that's a dummy field I'm using to assist in building user interface. I don't really need it for most of the variants that I'm going to show you. When I do the subform, this is an easy way to build a subform as one of the interfaces. And then it's very simple, your junction table, in this case, the user, and then their selections. So I think there's a lot of ways you can build this. They're all the same, right? Table of selections that you're going to choose from, your junction table. Then when the form loads, you clear out from the display the existing selections. Then you read your data table and you repopulate the selections for whatever is being displayed on that form. Then you have to have a way to select or deselect from display. Most of the ones I've done are normally a click. And then once you do that, you write from the junction table or delete from the junction table. So on this code here on the left, don't spend any time reading it. I'm just using this for the flow because no matter how I build it, they pretty much all look the same. When the form on the current event, that's where you're going to clear the selections from the display, then start reading your data table and then reselecting the ones for the current record. In this example, I'm using I think there's it's a multi-select list box. So then, step 2, read the junction table and start checking the ones that should be checked. Then somewhere you're going to have an event that allows you to click on something or somehow select it. So if it was previously selected, you're going to unselect it and you'll delete it. If it was previously unselected, you're going to select it and then you'll add it to your table. All right, so for my demo, I have 4 different ways I'm going to do it. I'll show you a subform as my user interface, a multi-select list box, an in-memory ADO record set, and a Crosstab. Okay, so this is what you're looking at. So I would go to that. So here's my user. Here's my subform. In this case, it's a subform, and I have that selection field. And then here are the ones that have been selected. So as I move to John Smith here, first thing it does, it clears out the checkboxes out of the table and then reads the normalized junction table and repopulates it. And so, I can click on it and I am adding to the junction table and I'm deleting to the junction table. I didn't need this here at the bottom, but it helps explain and because you can see up here clearly what's been selected anyways. All right, so that was using a subform, exact same idea with a multi-select listbox. Just it's probably a little easier to build it with a multi-select listbox. You just don't get the nice check. And then and we'll talk more about ADO record sets. I'll go a little bit because that's probably something some of you may be less familiar with using in-memory record sets. But the interface looks like this. In this case, I did it with a pop-up, makes it a lot easier, but the same idea. I'm using this as my interface. This is a pop-up form, but it's bound to an ADO in-memory record set that's basically built on the fly. So I add those selections on the fly. And what's nice about that is I can add any types of fields and I can add this Boolean field for my selections. And finally, and maybe this is what the user wanted all along, going back to the crosstab idea. So I got all my activities that they have to complete, and then you can just click, same idea. It's just writing it to the junction table, and I'm just requerying the crosstab to show the results. All right, so the ADODB and memory record sets, the beauty about these, you can add on the fly. It's not based off a table. It's almost like a collection or an array, except it has the beauty that you can bind it to a form. And so a lot of the ideas here really no different than what I showed on the scheduling problem of building a pseudo grid. Now I'm just building that without any kind of table, and it has that big benefit of you can do this without really any bloat like you would have if you're writing and deleting out of a temp table. And then most of the time when I do this, I've never really made really big ADO DB record sets. I've always done relatively small to support something like this. This is just giving you a kind of idea of how I did it. At the top of the module here, I define, but somewhere I define it as my record set as an ADODB record set. I declared it at the top of the module, not shown here. And then here's the important part. You can see it starts with the width and end width, where I append some fields. I create them on the fly. I needed a Boolean field to be my check and uncheck. I needed a field to display what that selection was. And then I need a little lower in the code, I need a PK field to relate it to the actual selection. And then I build that selection checklist by reading my table and then populating it. And so then I bound it to the form. And now I can use that as my tool to be my display. But it's really no different than the subform idea or the multi-select listbox idea. Just another way. This one's I call it the cascading combo dilemma, but I've seen it a lot recently. It seems to bother me. I don't know, other people don't seem to be bothered as much about it, but I think if you're doing this, it's wrong. So the problem is the user has a long list of choices and they're like, okay, I'm going to have to cascade this in order for me to pick the right choice. And in their mind, they know they're going to use a continuous form to make it even more challenging. And they think in order to do, just so that they can do cascading in their continuous form, they're going to add additional foreign keys that aren't in the right place. And I'll explain that. So over here on the right, you have a very long list of resources. And resources can be grouped by types, labor, material, and then they can get even further subgrouped within those categories, which allows you to do natural cascading. But a resource has a relationship to those groups in type. What I see the user do, my data table is a rate buildup. That's where I'm choosing a resource. Just so that they can do cascading, in the rate buildup table, they will add a foreign key that forces them to select type and a resource. Well, I've seen that and I'm like, that's not right, because now you've created a circular relationship. You have a relationship to the group and type through the resources table, but now you've added kind of a pseudo foreign keys in your rate buildup table just to allow you to do cascading. And like I said, I see people do this all the time and no one corrects it. So it might be my own personal thing. But what's the solution? I say, get away from using cascade and use a pop-up And especially when you have something big anyway, you can build a better interface. You don't have to put those artificial foreign keys inside your data table, but you still need a way to do that cascading. So that allows you, if we do a pop-up instead of cascades, I can keep what I think is a more proper structure. And now I know people argue, well, you can do a continuous form and you can do cascading and by adding unbound controls. And yeah, maybe it gets really complicated to do that. Here's my form, and I could show for display purposes the resource group and the resource type. I don't have it, but instead of having the cascading choices here, I would just pop up. They double click in here or click the button, select the resources. And I've been using this kind of display a lot because it allows me to use the power of a data sheet. So they can come in here and they can sort by type, they can sort by group, they can filter on description. You have all that stuff built in. And then I give them either a double click to save the resource, or they just simply hit the whatever record they're on and hit the OK add button. Hierarchical data and treeviews. I'm not going to go deep dive into treeviews. Again, the link to the previous presentation. Hierarchical data to me is hard to display without a tree view. It's very hard for a user to visualize it and get any idea how they're going to work with that data, especially if they're even considering using native forms and control. But the thing is, the actual data structure using a self-referent table is so simple. So the data structure is very simple, but how to use it becomes very hard. And the workarounds, the data structure becomes really complicated. So, do you see my presentation? I'm a huge fan of Treeviews, and I think that may be because of the types of databases I've been involved in, kind of more like engineering stuff, requirement mapping. Things just fall into this natural hierarchical pattern. But in my opinion, there's no better way to display, but more importantly, there's no better way to work with data once you start getting these dynamic levels and multiple levels. And common examples are like a family tree. A big one is the bill of materials, assembly, subassembly, part, dynamic tasks, subtasks where you don't know how many levels down you want to go. And then really anything that has numerous indefinite levels and groups. So I'd say, my bottom line, if you can learn the tree views, it will allow you to keep that data in that very simple self-referencing table, but make an intuitive display. And then today, what I'll talk about a little bit is often you want to have that hierarchical display where you may have multiple level, variable, indefinite levels, but you'd like to print it out in a report. It's kind of hard to print out the tree view control, or you want to show it in a standard form. So there's a couple tricks I use that allows me to kind of expand the tree view stuff to do that. So here's your challenge, the self-referencing tables. So you can see Linda Palowski. She's does not have a boss. That means she's a top level. And then you can kind of see the reason this is self-referencing. Boss ID is a foreign key. Your foreign key is in the same table as your primary key. Person ID is your primary key. In the same table is a foreign key relating back to the same table. And so Josh reports to his boss is number 3, who is not actually shown in the table right now. And then Forrest reports to Josh. So 4 reports to 4. Again, building this relationship table is really easy. Manipulating it, displaying it becomes really hard. And I've seen wacky attempts at doing this where they're kind of guessing at the different levels. They're building a parent table, a child table, child table, and all this stuff, I tell you, kind of eventually falls apart. There may be in some very rare cases where things are set in levels and they're never going to defer. But a simple one here, if you made a director's table, a manager's table, and an employee's table, it breaks down when you have an employee who's not reporting to a manager, but is a direct report to the director. So that will break down easily. And then even if you tried and had a little success of building multiple tables and coming up with multiple embedded subforms after 3 levels deep, it gets really unmanageable. But if it's dynamic or these rules are kind of broken where the relationships aren't clear, you're reporting to a guy 2 times up your chain, it's just it's not doable at all. So the display on the tree view, super intuitive, right? So I have Dr. Andrew Fuller, he's the director, and those are his direct reports. He has a sales administrator works directly, and then 2 managers. And then under the managers, you can see they have sales representatives, and they have Miss Nancy Brown as a business development under Pete. And then Laura has her 3. And then because Michael Suyama has such a big account, he has another dedicated BDR. But if you looked at that table and the user looks at that table and was trying to create this, that's the clear relationship. Look at this and try to figure this out. That Margaret Peacock somehow is 4 levels down from Dr. Fuller and reports to Suyama, who reports to Callahan. The users just can't figure that out. This kind of just shows you how those relationships. And so I'd say this is what you want to display. Think about it. If you haven't done tree views before, how would you do this with the native forms and subforms? And here's some examples, and here's some other benefits of it. There's some visual stuff. I can use icons. So here on the left, these are task and subtask. And you can see those are military unit symbols of who's responsible for the task. And then the beauty is some of the features that you can do with the tree view is you can promote a task, or move it, the whole branch under another task. You can move it up in the list. You can add and delete at the given level. Doing that, with any kind of form, subform, super hard. Then on the right, we had a little even more information. We can use color to show us the males and females. We got icons for those whales that are still alive within this whale family. And then we have icons for little angel icons for those deceased. Here's an example, and I got links to this one. It's just one. After I did my last presentation, I think Colin had posted it. Someone asked, well, hey, I saw this third-party application where you can organize things within your house into different locations, and you can build like sub-locations. So I can build the garage, and then I can put a cardboard box into that, and then I can put my Christmas lights in the cardboard box. Then I can roll up all my information and get total price within the box, total price within the garage, total price within the attic, and do stuff like that. So just kind of an example of where you could go with this. Intuitive display of the information. I know no other way you could do this easily without it. And then quickly, I would say is sometimes that tree view is nice, but I want to report out on that, or I want to maybe in conjunction use a standard form, but make it look like a tree view. And I learned after a while, if I can just save 2 bits of information. Now, I'm not going to go in detail here how I go about saving this information, but let's just say it can be done. So I save 2 things. I save the sort order of a tree. So once I build my tree, and most of these trees are loaded with some recursive call. That's how you have to do that. And I talked that in detail in the other presentation. But let's just say I can do that recursive call, load my tree. I can read my tree from the top down. So attic is 1, garage is 2, cardboard or holiday box is 3, blah, blah, blah. Then I just need to know how far to indent it. Attic and garage are at the top level. I call that node level. They're at node level 1. Holiday cardboard box and the shelf in the garage are indented a level. So they're at 2. All the items are at 3. And, some of these other ones, you can't see it, but I got some shelves as locations that are level 3. But if I know that order, and if I know how far it's indented, I can build something that looks like a tree view on a standard form. So here's on the left is a form, on the right's a report. And again, I'm using kind of that fake idea. On the form that looks like a tree, I can click the icon, edit the normalized record, do some code, and make it look edited. And on the right's the report. And now people say, yeah, but you can use sorting and grouping to do this. No. And the reason is because I could have dynamic levels. I could have 6 different levels. It's not really doable. I've tried it. There's only so much you can do. But if you can save sort order to make it look like a tree and indent, you can fake it, and you can do that for things like this. Or the thing I call the geolocate. So the challenge I had was locate items on an image, a map, and then once you save them, be able to go back to it and display the images in the right place. And this started with 3 attempts. The first one that I saw was someone said, hey, can you do this with a restaurant? I want to do a point of sale system. I want to make a floor plan, move these things. And I was like, yeah, this is kind of neat. This is kind of a toy problem. I don't ever see anybody really using it. Then it came to one said, hey, I saw that. Can you do this? Could you put icons on a boat to show where tasks need to get completed? And I was like, okay, that's a little bit more. Then the last one, someone saw that and said, I got a risk database where we're managing risks for a factory site. Could you locate risk and show them with color codings and stuff like that? And I was like, wow, that's a real world problem, because I've done risk management. And it's funny because the person I was working with was actually Russian, but the way they do risk management with severity and consequences, I was like, those are the same graphics. It was something I was very familiar with. So there's my toy problem with you drag and drop. You pick different table sizes. You can drag and drop those images on there. Here's the ship where I click, I can drop an icon, give it its priority. Then I can go around and click on it and then see the details. And then the real world problem is, you're looking at a site map of a factory, and then there's icons for the different risks with ability to filter risk. Click on any of those risks and pop up the details. Demo that one real quick. So let me see if I can move this out of the way. Okay. So first I pick a site location, and then every site could have multiple maps. And so this is one of the maps on that location. And then I have risks that aren't on the map yet, because in the database, they're not assigned to a map, and they're not assigned a location. And then I can just move them in. I'm not going to edit it right now, but trust me, I can double click here and bring it up. And then I added some filters so I can see significant and moderate, or just moderate. Okay, so the map, that may look pretty complicated, but actually the data structure is super simple. I'm saving an X position, a Y position, left and top, and the foreign key to which map or which image it's on. And okay, this is not really geo-reference. I called it pseudo. Yeah, I can't bring up another image and it will locate on that image in the correct place. It's only going to work with that image at that resolution. But for the user, they were more than happy. Moving those images around or those labels around. I built a class module, and that's why all this stuff kind of, after I did it the first time, I was like, oh, that's easy. I can do that. I built this class module. You just instantiate this thing as a movable label. Then you can just drag and drop it wherever you want. And in its drop event, it raises a custom event that reports out its X and Y position and its primary key. And then the trick is, on all those forms, I start with a whole bunch of hidden labels. I read the table. Once I pick the location and the map, I find the correct risk. I read through that, and then I just start. If I have 10 risks, I read them. I grab the first 10 labels in order and show them and put them on the map in the right spot. Okay, so I did provide some links, but I talked to Colin. I will send him databases. So because all these links are on Access World forums. But there's some good discussion on there too. So if you do have time, you can go there. So I have a ton of TreeView stuff on there. Goes into much more detail. Plus, you can look at the previous presentation. Pseudo Grid scheduling problem. Lots and lots of different calendars to include that year calendar. For the geo reference, I think I have a little example. It's not a complete example of the risk. I've actually improved that a lot, but I have that restaurant one and the ships. And then, like I said, I didn't do a deep dive, especially did not show you where you can actually edit into that denormalized table directly and then right back to your normal table. Pat Harmon did a presentation to Access User Group Specific, and she shows an example of a very deep dive and a much more complicated form with lots of columns that write back. So do we have time for questions?
Yes, we will have time for questions.
Okay.
I think people are probably so shell shocked with the amount of information you've given that they haven't had time to write many questions down. But I'll go through the ones that there are. If first of all, can I just ask at the beginning? Pete asked whether the organisation of surveys and creation of surveys would be an interesting topic for a future presentation. If you think it would be, would you please just put your hand up, click the raise hand button now, so I get an idea of how many people would be interested in that. 4 people. Okay, thank you. If you could put your hands down again. Tim Finch asked about ADO record sets, in-memory record sets, and asked why you use ADO rather than DAO. You answered it almost immediately afterwards, but I think it'd be worth just going back to that, Pete, if you wouldn't mind. Can you just explain that point again?
Yeah, well, DA, it doesn't exist, right? So we're building the beauty of this is you don't start with a table. DAO, you have to start with something, a table or a query or something like this. You're starting with nothing, and it's more like building a array or building a dictionary or even a collection. You're kind of doing that on the fly and defining what all those fields are going to be.
It's a good way of getting a record set without actually putting the data into a table. It's also faster than retrieving the data from a table as well. Yes, Aid.
Sorry, very quick, because there's been a lot of chat about it in the
raise hands. Yeah,
I was going to say I did wonder when you asked the question, should you perhaps have gone through how to raise your hand first? Because I don't think it's a very
it seems not. It seems a lot of people didn't know. It's on the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. I can't tell you exactly where, because when you're the host, you get a different toolbar. But there should be a button that says raise hand. And I think it was Ben has said it is next under the React menu at the bottom of the screen.
You click React, and then one of the options in there is to raise your hand. It's quite a prominent option once you've clicked React. You can click React without that's by clicking React. It doesn't immediately give a reaction. It gives you an option to choose a reaction. So a lot of people wouldn't have dared to click it thinking that it might have given a reaction straight away.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and there's at least 3 more people that wanted to raise their hand that were unable to do so. So I think we've got quite a few people would be interested in that for a future topic, whether it be Pete presenting it or if somebody else would like to volunteer, that would also be interesting as well. Right, I'm going to come to Lex now.
If he could explain from this data structure or the column field in the table, the difference between a tree and a network, because I think a network has many parents and many children, whereas a tree doesn't. Tree only has a parent or a child. Yeah, a tree has one parent. Am I right in that, or can you detail? Thank you.
So, can you do a graph in a tree? So you can. It just doesn't. It doesn't display well. Like if you think like a binary tree, right? Looks like a pyramid. If you turn that on its side, that can be done in a tree. It just won't give you the same kind of presentation that way.
I was wondering about the data storage. Is there a difference in how you store it and what field you have in relationships?
In a graph, you can have a tree is a subset of a graph, right? Because you can only have one parent in this case for display purposes. There's no node falls under more than one node, and I think that would be the difference. You could the structure would be the same. It would be kind of the display would be not intuitive. So I want to see if I can go back and I'll kind of explain that what it would look like if, in fact, let's just pick someone, Ann Dodsworth, who falls under Pete Davellino.
Yes.
Well, if in a graph, well, Ann could also fall under Janet Leverell. Doesn't make much sense here, but maybe you're doing like for administrative an operational or matrix organization. In your tree, it would be the exact same structure, right? So I have to have another, well, and I have to think about that, how you would organize that. No, I think you would just repeat the primary key. So Anne would have another primary key, but a different reports to. And so this is more like a junction table. So Anne record would appear twice in here with all her bosses.
Would it be fair to say, Peter, that you've actually already answered that question, and that what makes a tree view not a network is that a tree view is limited to one parent? Doesn't have to have a parent, but it's limited to. So I think that answers Lex's question fully and perfectly.
Yeah, so it's a self join. It has to be a self join. If it's a network, you have to have a junction. I think that's what you said.
Well, just for example here, if we said that Ann Dodsworth had two bosses, right? Now that's normally not what happens in a tree, but let's just say we have some rules that Ann can work for three bosses. And I guess that's kind of reality in a lot of corporations nowadays. She would appear on this table under three people. And in the table, you would see Ann's 9. You would see 9, Dodsworth 10. You would see 9, 2, and 9, 6, or whatever. And then she would appear under all of those positions, multiple times. It won't be very intuitive, I don't think. There is not a good display for. And I've actually done that challenge on some other things I've done. I had some examples of graph theory where I do knapsack problems, shortest path, Dijkstra algorithms. So and that could be another presentation. And I've never figured out a good way to display information like that. Tree is the closest you can get to, but it's hard to see that relationship where you have one node with multiple parents.
Thank you.
It wouldn't fit a tree view, Peter. And Neil has asked a similar question, and I don't think you can display in a tree view only when each item has a maximum of one parent.
No, like I said, I can show. It just won't be intuitive. I could repeat Ann Dodsworth, and I could put her under three different people here.
Yeah. You can in the tree view control, you can repeat Ann Dodsworth in multiple nodes. She has a unique node in the control. She's in multiple nodes on it.
Yes. I just have to play with my keys to ensure that each node has some kind of unique ID to do that. But I could do that.
You have to
let me do that as an example, and I'll post that and send it. My point is that's more like a network or a graph. The problem is not when you look at it, you're not going to get that information where you would get if there was a way to really draw it out as a graph. But I could do a demo on that just to show you it can be done, but why it's maybe not going to give you the intuitive information.
Changing the subject back to the ADO record sets, a couple of people asked you could explain how you bind an ADO record set.
You do it exactly like you do it DAO. You just set the record set property.
Okay, that's fine. Right. Domenico made a comment about the tree view examples you showed were very much like a Cradle management information system.
I believe it's a British company, Cradle, and I thought maybe you had been familiar with it, but that informational tree with the different icons and the use of color was very familiar to that, and that was used quite a bit back on the NASA Constellation program. Yeah,
and in my presentation, there's an ActiveX control that you can use that I just wish that Access would bring a native control, because the one I use a lot, the ActiveX, is a little quirky. It's a little unstable. There's a JKP uses an MS Forms, and then Colin recently has sent me several other either free or pay ones that you can use inside of Access. So there are several different controls you can get to do it. Most common is the ActiveX.
Right, a lot of people have thanked you for an excellent presentation. If I can just make it clear that the PowerPoint is already available, or the presentation PDF of the PowerPoint is available on my website. I'll give you the link again. I'll put it in the chat. I'll give you it on the screen shortly. And for those who aren't aware of Pete through Access World forums, he's probably one of the most skilled and highly advanced problem solvers there, coming up with many innovative solutions to often complex issues. And the examples he's given here are just a small subset of the ones he's done. So, right, there's a lot of good stuff there. Pete, is there anything else you wanted to show on the screen before I take over and share?
Well, no, I think that's all I had. That was all my examples.
If you didn't actually pick this up, then the web page for this, the presentation is at isleofdogs.co.uk AEU41. I will put a copy on the main website along with any access databases that Pete sends me. But thank you again for an incredibly detailed and highly complex presentation. The amount you packed into an hour was quite amazing there. Right, I'm just going to go on to next month. Now, I first planned to do this presentation in May, and I put it off 4 times because dates kept getting postponed. And in the end, I changed the title as well. So I'm going to be doing some of the new and forthcoming features in Access. I already knew before I changed the title that they were going to delay the things in the roadmap. And this is the outline of it on my website here. And I'll just enlarge that slightly. So I'm going to be covering some features that you may or may not have tried out yourself, including VBA support for modern charts, what you can do with it, and the fact that you can actually change chart features and appearance and chart styles at runtime. Probably a more niche market, command line project signing and time stamping, so you can ensure that even if the certificate expires, that the project remains signed, which is a recent change there. There's a new Create SQL Query button if you haven't yet seen it, and there are significant improvements to the Monaco SQL editor. Now, some of these are still in the beta or preview channels. Some have actually made their way through to the main or current channel there. What I was hoping to do was a demonstration of the responsive forms and large monitor support feature that was due to roll out in June and July. It has been postponed officially till September now. I haven't updated this webpage to say that, and I'm hoping it will arrive in September. It's not that it was more complicated than they expected, or they just haven't got round to doing it, but they have been diverted. The whole of the Office team have been diverted by some important security work that was basically imposed upon them, and so everything else had to take place second fiddle to that, which has now been completed. So they're going back to this, and I'm hoping I will at least have some slides to show you of what the screens will look like. In September, we will have Adam Waller, who is here as well. Welcome, Adam. And he's going to be doing a presentation about source code control, and with an emphasis on why source code control is actually of use to single developers, which many of the people here are. One of the questions that came up at a recent DevCon presentation that he did. But at this point, I just want to go back to last month's presenter, Domenico Ruggiero, who has updated the support files of the various things that he was demonstrating last month. Domenico, would you like to share your screen?
And thank you very much. I will be very brief. And this is just as a gratitude to Colin for an opportunity to just update everybody. I had tech demo files that we showed. There was a hiccup with some of the word, and we didn't have time to get into everything else. I simply just want to take 1 or 2 minutes here just to point out that even though I had the very blah user interface, I did improve on it a little bit here, trying to also demonstrate that as these applications are working together, and I just paused the code just to show this, that there'll be a line connecting what application are talking to each other. And so as the process goes through the lines that connect between Access and Excel to Word and Access to Word, etc., those lines will show there that basically coordination is taking place. Another update was that even though we were we had demonstrated the ability to update the Excel matrix here on the right-hand side and how that quickly gets updated into the PowerPoint. There was a pivot chart that was already in the workbook. So if you've seen it, you saw the pivot charts that were there, but they weren't refreshing the content on slide 2 and 3. So those are there now. And the other thing I put in here for options on top of the user interface aspect of it all was that at the beginning there for my tech demo, it was push one button and it just goes from start to finish. And now you have the ability to customize what is it that you want to run. And part of that is driven from the fact that when I go to generate these incident reports, it can take a little time. I think part of it might be my Grammarly is trying to do some spell checking and grammar updates to Word as it's going about. So the ability to uncheck some of these things, if you don't need to run that part of the automation, you can uncheck, including the notion of unchecking here if you want to just hide the screen updates in Word until it's done. That is another way to try to speed things up. It's like turning off Excel automatic calculations to manual until you're done, and then you turn it back on, something along those lines. But the last thing I'll show again in the Word document, because that was the part we really didn't get a chance to talk too much about, is that it does bring in the matrix and then it will generate these like incident reports like they are individual items. And you'll notice that the formatting is here, there's color, different choices of fonts and more, and all of that's driven from the template that's at the back. So if you were to hit the end of the document, but there is a template at the end that has all of these respective tags. And just by changing its color, its font, its, just any of its properties for the tag itself changes how these incident reports are shown. So again, this is updated. You'll find it off of the same page that you were able to access as is up on the page here. Thank you. I'll just wrap it up with that. Thank you for the opportunity, Colin.
Thank you ever so much, Domenico. That was excellent. Thank you again to Pete for an excellent presentation. I've seen that a lot of people are interested in the idea of a session on surveys in the future as well. All right, I think I will give you time off for good behaviour and see you next month, me presenting, and hopefully I will have some more information about the forthcoming features to actually thrill you with. See you again next month.